This morning I talked about Boris Johnson's reaction to the watered down Sue Gray, well, let's call it preliminary report. Because of the police request, it is a very watered down version now. I'll come to that a bit later again. But in this video, I want to do what I do in rare cases when it's really important to know the full facts. And that means I will go through the full report with you in this video. And the thing already starts in the beginning. It's called Investigation into Alleged Gatherings on Government Premises During COVID Restrictions. And then there's the point, update. So from the beginning, it's only called update and not final report. And that's quite important for everything that's going on and what happened in Parliament on Monday. And then she recaps how it came to her conducting the investigation. First, on December 8th, the Prime Minister asked the Cabinet Secretary to carry out an investigation into allegations that were reported in the media related to gatherings in number 10 Downing Street and also the Department for Education during November and December in 2020. The next step was, on December 17th, the Cabinet Secretary recused himself from the investigation as a result of allegations concerning an online quiz held by his private office in the Cabinet Office on December 17th in 2020 in 70 Whitehall. It was at this point that Sue Gray was asked to lead this work. And third, the terms of reference for the investigations were published on December 9th. That's Annex A. We will go through that at the end of the video. The primary purpose of the investigation was to establish a general understanding of the nature of the gatherings, including attendance, the setting, and the purpose, with reference to adherence to the guidance in place at that time. And the fourth is, where there were credible allegations relating to other gatherings, these could also be investigated. And we all know Sue Gray did that. And five is, in line with those terms of reference, the following events were in scope. May 15th, 2020, a photograph showing a number of groups in the garden of number 10 Downing Street. Then, May 20th in 2020, a gathering in the garden of number 10 Downing Street for number 10 staff. And then we have June 18th in 2020, a gathering in the Cabinet Office, 70 Whitehall, on the departure of a number 10 private secretary. Then we have June 19th in 2020, a gathering in the Cabinet Room in number 10 Downing Street on the Prime Minister's birthday. And then we had November 13th in 2020, a gathering in the number 10 Downing Street flat, also a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of a special advisor. And then we have November 27th in 2020, a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of a special advisor. And then we have December 10th, 2020, a gathering in the Department for Education ahead of the Christmas break. And we have December 15th in 2020, a gathering in number 10 Downing Street for an online Christmas quiz. And then we have December 17th in 2020, a gathering in Cabinet Office 70 Whitehall to hold an online Christmas quiz for the Cabinet Secretary's private office. And we have a gathering in Cabinet Office 70 Whitehall on the departure of a senior Cabinet Office official. And we have a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of a number 10 official. Then we have December 18th, 2020, a gathering in number 10 Downing Street ahead of the Christmas break. And on January 14th in 2021, there was a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of two number 10 private secretaries. And on April 16th in 2021, a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of a senior number 10 official. and a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on the departure of another number 10 Downing Street official. Those are not all part of this report because of the Metropolitan Police request, but this list confirms that the Prime Minister is under police investigation now, although he always evades questions by referring to the police investigation, and everyone would have to wait for that to end. But Sue Gray first explains the methodology of the investigation after listing all those dates. 6 says, there has been widespread public interest in and concern about a number of gatherings taking place in number 10 Downing Street and Whitehall during periods of national COVID restrictions where their necessity for work purposes has been open to question. My task has been to establish as far as possible the facts surrounding these gatherings. With that, she's saying that she's not drawing any conclusions. She has to gather the facts. And in 7, she says, in carrying out my investigation, I have been supported by a small team of senior civil servants in the Cabinet Office who have no connection with these events under examination and who are bound by the requirements of the Civil Service Code. We carried out interviews of over 70 individuals, some more than once, and examined relevant documentary and digital information such as emails, WhatsApp messages, text messages, photographs, and building entry and exit logs. This has also included searches of official records. As such, extensive substantive factual information is now available and has been compiled by me and my team to fulfill my obligation to establish the facts. The investigative work is now essentially complete. So that there she says she could have made a real full report, but we have the police there. In 8, the Treasury Solicitor and Daniel Steelitz QC have provided independent advice as to the process. And in number 9, she says, it's not for me to make a judgment on whether the criminal law has been broken. That is properly a matter for law enforcement. In line with my terms of reference, I have been in regular contact with the Metropolitan Police as my work has progressed in order for them to take decisions on the gatherings under examination, including whether to launch their own investigation. And we all know they did that in the end. In number 10, she says, the Metropolitan Police has now confirmed that as a result of information provided by the Cabinet Office investigation team, as well as assessments made by Metropolitan Police officers, they are investigating the events on the dates set out above, with the exception of the gatherings on, and here we go, May 15th in 2020, November 27th in 2020, December 10th in 2020, and December 15th in 2020. And that means those 4 dates are the only dates left for Sue Gray to really write about in this report. Everything else will only come to light after the police investigation. And that is still a long list. But then she still continues with what she can do. 11th is the police have confirmed that on the basis of the information available, the gatherings on these 4 dates are not considered to have reached the threshold for criminal investigation. It's still not saying that those have been legal. That's what I'm saying. In number 12, she says, no conclusion should be drawn or inferences made from this other than it is now for the police to consider the relevant material in relation to those incidents. The police have also said this does not in itself mean that they will decide to take further action or that there has necessarily been a breach of the regulations. But I say it's most probable. In 13, she says, At the request of the police, I've provided the material compiled in the course of my investigation relevant to the gatherings that they are now investigating. I have also been asked to retain all the other information collected in the course of this work, which I have confirmed that I will do. I will therefore ensure that the secure storage and safekeeping of all the information gathered until such time as it may be required further. I will not be circulating the information internally within government. It has been provided in confidence to the Cabinet Office investigation team. And it is important that this confidence is maintained to protect the integrity of the process. Well, if that is leaked to Johnson, then he could blow up the whole thing probably. In 14, she says, as a result of the Metropolitan Police investigations and so as not to prejudice the police investigative process, they have told me that it would only be appropriate to make minimal reference to the gatherings on the dates they are investigating. Unfortunately, this necessarily means that I'm extremely limited in what I can say about those events, and it is not possible at present to provide a meaningful report setting out and analyzing the extensive factual information I've been able to gather. So there she herself says it's not a meaningful report what we have. And as I said, it's just an update. In 15, she says, in respect of the gatherings that the Metropolitan Police has assessed as not reaching the threshold for criminal investigation, they have not requested any limitations be placed on the descriptions of those events. However, I have decided not to publish factual accounts in relation to those 4 dates. I do not feel that I am able to do so without detriment to the overall balance of the findings. So in the end, we will find out about all of them, hopefully. In 16, she says, more generally, I did consider whether it would be better to pause as provided for in the terms of reference and to wait until the conclusion of the police investigation before publishing anything. However, given the widespread public interest in and concerns about these matters, and to avoid further delay, I am providing an update on the investigation, and I am setting out some general findings now. I have not made comment on whether individual gatherings were in line with the relevant guidelines and also the regulations in place at the time. I did not judge it appropriate to do so given the police investigation that is now underway. And that means we don't get too much here in this update. Then she explains the context of the whole situation and the bigger picture. On 17, she writes, the outbreak and spread of SARS-CoV-19 represented a global public health crisis without parallel in living memory. In the United Kingdom, it had a seismic impact on every aspect of life in the country. In response, to help control the spread of the virus and to keep the most vulnerable safe, the UK government put in place far-reaching restrictions on citizens that had direct and material impact on their lives, livelihood, and liberties. From March 26th in 2020, the law in England required everyone to remain in their home unless certain, very limited exemptions applied. Restrictions were temporarily eased over the summer period in 2020 until most remaining national restrictions were removed on July 4th in 2020. Restrictions were then reintroduced in gradations in the autumn, culminating in the UK government announcing from November 5th in 2020 restrictions on movements and gatherings in England, essentially requiring people to stay at home. Restrictions on gatherings of 2 or more people applied in London through December 2020 and the first months of 2021. Indoor mixing of 2 or more households was not permitted again until May 17th in 2021. A chronology of the main changes is in Annex B, and I have that for you later too. And 19, in line with those rules, the vast majority of staff in government departments worked from home. The civil service, along with the rest of the public sector, went to great lengths to reconfigure the provision and delivery of public services and support for businesses almost overnight. Many private sector businesses and other organizations, large and small, all over the UK, were also working hard to deal with the pandemic, both in terms of managing their businesses, their livelihoods, and those of their employees, as well as providing vital support to the national effort to respond to the virus. And in 20, she says, a small number of government officials and special advisors, because of the nature of their jobs, directly supporting the Prime Minister and other ministers, continued to attend their offices for the purposes of work, as permitted by an exemption under the regulations. And in number 21, she says, in particular, number 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office were at the center of the government's response to the pandemic. Tight-knit groups of officials and advisors worked long hours under difficult conditions in buildings that could not be easily adapted as COVID-secure workplaces. Number 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office in 70 Whitehall are closely interconnected, with staff moving regularly between the two buildings as part of their daily work. The Prime Minister's flat and the Downing Street garden are in close proximity to the offices and serve a dual office and also private purpose. And in number 22, she says, those challenges, however, also apply to key and frontline workers across the country who were working under equally, if not more, demanding conditions, often at risk to their own health. It is important to remember the stringency of the public health regulations in force in England over the relevant periods, and that criminal sanctions were applied to many found to be in breach of them. The hardship under which citizens across the country worked, lived, and sadly even died while observing the government's regulations and guidance rigorously are known only too well. And then we already come to number 23. She says, every citizen has been impacted by the pandemic. Everyone has made personal sacrifices, some the most profound, having been unable to see loved ones in their last moments or care for vulnerable family and friends. It is with that context in mind that I make the following general limited findings. And that's the point, because then she comes to the general findings in her update, but they are extremely limited. Well, I don't even want to call this a report anymore under those circumstances, really. The first is, against the backdrop of the pandemic, when the government was asking citizens to accept far-reaching restrictions on their lives, some of the behavior surrounding these gatherings is difficult to justify. Well, and she's a civil servant, so I have to give her that language. I would have said something else. At least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also of the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. And I really have to agree with that. They're not more equal under equals. At the time, it seems there was too little thought given to what was happening across the country in considering the appropriateness of some of these gatherings, the risks they presented to public health, and how they might appear to the public. There were failures of leadership and judgment by different parts of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office at different times. Some of the events should not have been allowed to take place. Other events should not have been allowed to develop as they did. And who, that's what I'm asking, is the leadership in Number 10. But she says, the excessive consumption of alcohol is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. Steps must be taken to ensure that every government department has a clear and robust policy in place covering the consumption of alcohol in the workplace. And there I just want to say that Johnson told them to relax there like that. She says the use of the garden at Number 10 Downing Street should be primarily for the Prime Minister and the private residents of Number 10 and Number 11 Downing Street. During the pandemic, it was often used as an extension of the workplace as a more COVID-secure means of holding group meetings in ventilated space. This was a sensible measure that staff appreciated, but the garden was also used for gatherings without clear authorization or oversight. This was not appropriate. Any official access to the space, including for meetings, should be by invitation only and in a controlled environment. Some staff wanted to raise concerns about behaviors they witnessed at work, but at times felt unable to do so. No member of staff should feel unable to report or challenge poor conduct where they witness it. There should be easier ways for staff to raise such concerns informally outside of the line of management chain. The number of staff working in Number 10 Downing Street has steadily increased in recent years. In terms of size, scale, and range of responsibility, it is now more akin to a small government department than purely a dedicated Prime Minister's office. The structures that support the smooth operation of Downing Street, however, have not evolved sufficiently to meet the demands of this expansion. The leadership structures are fragmented and complicated, and this has sometimes led to the blurring of lines of accountability. Too much responsibility and expectation is placed on the senior official whose principal function is the direct support of the Prime Minister. This should be addressed as a matter of priority. And then she comes to her conclusion. But always remember, she only talks about 4 dates out of that long list of dates from the beginning of the video. She says, the gatherings within the scope of this investigation are spread over a 20-month period, a period that has been unique in recent times in terms of the complexity and breadth of the demands on public servants and indeed the general public. The whole of the country rose to the challenge. Ministers, special advisors, and the civil service, of which I am proud to be a part, were a key and dedicated part of that national effort. However, as I have noted, a number of these gatherings should not have been allowed to take place or to develop in the way that they did. There is significant learning to be drawn from these events, which must be addressed immediately across government. This does not need to wait for the police investigations to be concluded. And that's what Boris Johnson is always talking about. But the results from the rest are yet to come. And then there's Annex A I talked about earlier, the terms of reference. Investigations into staff gatherings in number 10 Downing Street and the Department for Education. I just want to put this in for completion as well. The Prime Minister has asked the Cabinet Secretary to carry out investigations into allegations made of a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on November 27th in 2020, a gathering at the Department for Education on December 10th in 2020, and allegations made of a gathering in number 10 Downing Street on December 18th in 2020. Where there are credible allegations relating to other gatherings, these may be investigated. The primary purpose will be to establish swiftly a general understanding of the nature of these gatherings, including attendance, the setting, and the purpose, with reference to adherence to the guidance in place at the time. If required, the investigations will establish whether individual disciplinary action is warranted. Well, that's what's not happening now because of the police investigation. The work will be undertaken by officials in the Cabinet Office at the direction of the Cabinet Secretary, with support from the Government Legal Department. The team will have access to all relevant records and be able to speak to members of staff. And that she definitely did, but we don't learn that much about this yet. As with all internal investigations, if during the course of the work any evidence emerges of behavior that is potentially a criminal offense, the matter will be referred to the police and the Cabinet Office's work may be paused. That's what she referred to earlier. Matters relating to adherence to the law are properly for the police to investigate, and the Cabinet Office will liaise with them as appropriate. Any matters relating to the conduct of ministers should follow the process set out in the Ministerial Code in the normal way, and that's why she's not talking about what's having to come. All ministers, special advisors, and civil servants will be expected to cooperate with the investigations. But I expect the government to react under those codes now, but they won't. Any staff with information relevant to the investigations should provide it to the Cabinet Office investigation team. Pastoral care and support will be provided to all staff involved. The findings of the investigations will be made public. Yeah, here we are at the moment. Following the long-standing practice of successive administrations, any specific HR action against individuals will remain confidential. Then there's also Annex B, where she recaps the timeline of regulations. I talked about this earlier. On March 26th in 2020, restrictions on leaving one's home without a reasonable excuse, first announced on March 23rd, come into legal effect in England. Very limited exceptions permit travel to work where it is not reasonably possible to work from home. Participating in a gathering of more than 2 persons is prohibited, except where the gathering is essential for work purposes. On May 13th in 2020, leaving or being outside one's home without a reasonable excuse continues to be prohibited. Some restrictions are relaxed to allow meeting outdoors for exercise or recreation with one person from another household. Guidance encourages those who cannot work from home to go back to work. At work, social distancing advice applies, with workplaces required to avoid crowding and minimize opportunities for the virus to spread by maintaining a distance of at least 2 meters, or she writes 3 steps between individuals wherever possible. On June 1st in 2020, England moves to step 2 of the government's roadmap, in which restrictions on leaving one's home are removed. Gatherings of 2 or more persons indoors and more than 6 outdoors are prohibited. An exception permit gatherings that are reasonably necessary for work purposes. Work purposes. That's not work purposes. On June 15th in 2020, non-essential retail businesses are permitted to reopen, and individual prayer in places of worship is allowed again. And on July 4th in 2020, most remaining national restrictions are removed as pubs and restaurants reopen. Gatherings of more than 30 persons are prohibited. And on July 5th in 2020, despite the removal of most national restrictions, local restrictions are retained and reintroduced during July and August in certain areas, including Leicester, Bolton, Greater Manchester, and the North East. And then we have, September 14th in 2020. A restriction on gatherings of more than 6 persons indoors and outdoors, the so-called Rule of 6, is introduced, subject to exceptions which includes where the gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. On October 14th in 2020, a tiered system of progressive restrictions is introduced. London is moved to Tier 2, that means high, from October 17th, in which 2 or more persons are prohibited from meeting indoors. And then we have November 5th in 2020. A second national lockdown is introduced which requires people to stay at home and which prohibits gatherings with people from other households except for permitted exceptions, including where the gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. Well, I don't see any in Downing Street when you have Zoom and Jitsi and stuff like that. On December 2nd in 2020, England is divided again into 3 tiers, with London in Tier 2, in which gatherings of 2 or more persons continue to be prohibited unless an exception, such as where the gathering is reasonably necessary for work and work purposes, applies. Government guidance for the Christmas period on visiting pubs and restaurants advises, although there are exemptions for work purposes, you must not have a work Christmas lunch or party where that is primarily a social activity and is not otherwise permitted by the rules in your tier. And we're still talking about London. On December 16th in 2020, London is moved to Tier 3. Indoor gatherings of 2 or more persons from different households continue to be prohibited. Social distancing remains the rule at work, with officers advised to maintain social distancing guidelines, that means 2 meters or 1 meter with risk mitigation where 2 meter is not viable, wherever possible, including while arriving at and departing from work, while in work, and when traveling between sites. And there's December 20th in 2020. London is moved to a newly created Tier 4 with much of southeast England to help control the Alpha variant. The stay-at-home restrictions prohibit leaving one's home except for permitted purposes. And on January 6th in 2021, all areas of England are moved into Tier 4 stay-at-home restrictions. This is the 3rd national lockdown. The stay-at-home restrictions prohibit leaving one's home, except for permitted exceptions, which include where it is reasonably necessary for the purposes of work and where it's not reasonably possible to work from home. You can't do it everywhere, but meetings you often can have online, I say. Then we have March 29th in 2021. All areas of England move to Step 1 and the stay-at-home restrictions are lifted. Gatherings of 2 or more persons indoors or more than 6 persons outdoors are prohibited, subject to exceptions which include where a gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. We hear that a lot here, but when it's reasonably necessary. Then we have April 12th in 2021. All of England moves to step 2. Non-essential retail businesses and many outdoor venues reopen, but the restrictions on social mixing indoors and outdoors do not change. And then there's May 17th in 2021. All of England moves to step 3, permitting 6 persons or 2 households to mix indoors and up to 30 people to mix outdoors. This report, as watered down as it still is, it still tells us a lot, and the government here in my country would have had to resign after such a report and not to wait until the police investigation. But Johnson is still using the police investigation and the censorship on this report as a shield and carries it in front of him to deflect everything anybody says. Boris Johnson will now sacrifice some of his staff with Operation Red Meat and with the founding of the Sue Gray report and present himself as a crackdown hero who cracks down, but to save his own skin. Unfortunately, with all his diversionary tactics, we're really going to have to wait for the police to finish their investigation, although it's a prime minister the police is investigating against. Imagine that. It is to be hoped that the rebels will then regain their courage. But please do share this video. It's important that as many people as possible know the full report or the update and not some biased summaries. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.